What happened in those first crossings, when human beings looked out over dark water and chose not to turn back? The question drifts through prehistory like fog over a submerged coast, because the coast itself is often gone. So much of the evidence may rest beneath seas that rose, patiently and without ceremony, over the places where departure once felt possible. Before the body settles more deeply into this quiet, there is one small ritual worth asking. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if there is truly something here worth keeping. And if sleep has not yet carried the listener too far, let them leave their location and local time below, like a faint lantern placed on a distant shore. Somewhere beyond that gesture waits the memory of the first vanished voyage. The oldest migrations across oceans do not begin with a triumphant fleet, or a carved harbour, or a written account preserved in stone. They begin with absence, a gap in the record, gap in the a silence where certainty should be. Modern history often likes to imagine that the first true mariners belonged to civilizations already dressed in symbols of order. Kingdoms, monuments, maps, priesthoods, names. But the human story appears to whisper something less comfortable. It suggests that long before the rise of cities, long before writing taught memory how to sit still, people were already standing at the edge of moving water, measuring wind with skin, measuring distance with fear, and deciding that the unknown ahead was somehow survivable. That is where the unease begins. Australia, or more precisely the ancient landmass known as Sahul, was never simply reached by walking from mainland Asia. Even when sea levels were far lower during the Ice Age, even when coastlines stretched outward and islands stood closer together, stretches of open water still interrupted the path. This has been understood for some time. The broad fact is not especially controversial. Human beings arrived in Seoul tens of thousands of years ago, perhaps more than 60,000 years before the present, and to do that they crossed water. Not a puddle, not a river, not some accidental drift from one visible beach to another, but water deep and dangerous enough to force a choice. The choice itself leaves no skeleton. It leaves no clean fossil. It leaves instead a discomforting implication. If they crossed, then they planned. If they planned, then they gathered materials, remembered currents, watched skies, coordinated bodies, and trusted one another enough to step onto something that floated. That simple chain of thought should not feel revolutionary, and yet it still disturbs the older instinct to place sophistication late in the story, safely near the civilizations that later wrote themselves into permanence. Perhaps that is part of the reason the earlier sea migrations feel so strangely underlit. The tools of ocean crossing were made from things the Earth does not like to preserve: wood, fibre, hide, reed, sinew, bark. A vessel could carry a future and then vanish without residue. A paddle could alter the destiny of a species and rot into anonymity. The archaeological imagination is often strongest when it touches stone, bone, charcoal, walls. But the sea is governed by another archive, one that deletes gently and with astonishing completeness. It does not merely hide. It softens edges until later minds begin to doubt that anything substantial was ever there. And then there is the rising water itself. At the end of the last ice age, global sea levels climbed and kept climbing, swallowing continental shelves, estuaries, lagoons, campsites, paths, and perhaps the very beaches from which these migrations were launched. The world known to those early travellers was not the world traced on modern maps. Entire coastal plains once stretched where waves now move in silence. What had been habitable land became seabed. What had been a root became a depth sounding. It is difficult not to feel, in that transformation, the shape of a civilizational amnesia produced not by malice at first, but by climate, time, and water. The first chapters may not be missing because no one wrote them. They may be missing because the page itself was drowned. Still, the mystery darkens when one lingers over capability. Could small groups of Paleolithic humans really have navigated these crossings intentionally? The question is usually asked with caution, sometimes even with disbelief, as if deep time must also mean simple minds. Yet that assumption reveals more about modern vanity than ancient limitation. These people did not need compasses engraved in brass or celestial diagrams inked on parchment to understand a horizon. They had weather, repetition, observation, and necessity. They lived close enough to coastlines to read them with the body. They could study birds at dawn, cloud forms over islands, the behaviour of tides, the drift of vegetation, the pattern of returning fish. Intelligence does not arrive all at once in the form approved by later empires. It often begins as attention sharpened by survival. There are scholars who suggest that some crossings may have occurred by accident, that storms or currents could have carried people into new worlds. It is not an impossible thought. History contains many accidents, but accident alone struggles to explain settlement. One drift voyage might produce a legend, or a grave, or a lost family whose names never reached shore again. Settlement implies repetition, or at least success that could be communicated, imitated, expanded. One crossing becomes less mysterious than the second, and the second less than the third. Soon there is not only arrival, but knowledge. Not only courage, but tradition. Somewhere in that invisible sequence, an ocean stops being a barrier and becomes a road. And roads, once forgotten, are among the most haunting things in history. Because if these people carried maritime knowledge deep into prehistory, what else travelled with them? Fire, of course, tools, stories, kinship systems, rituals for departure, explanations for storms, perhaps songs timed to the rhythm of paddling, perhaps rules about stars that could not yet be called astronomy, though they already functioned as one. It is easy to underestimate what had to exist before the crossing, because almost none of it survives in material form. But survival is not the same as reality. A vanished canoe may have mattered more than a preserved spear point. A lost shoreline may hold more truth than a celebrated inland cave. This is where the historical wound opens wider. The official story is not necessarily false, but it may be narrower than the sea ever was. It tells of migrations in steppes, dates, genetic branches, archaeological horizons. All of that has value, all of it matters. Yet between the measured facts there remains a human atmosphere that numbers cannot keep. Someone had to step first into instability. Someone had to watch land diminish behind them. Someone had to endure the possibility that the world ahead would not return what had just been left behind. That moment belongs not only to science, but to a deeper condition of being human. To migrate across water is to accept that memory may fail before courage does. And once that is understood, another possibility begins to stir, quieter and more troubling. What if early ocean migration was not a rare anomaly at the edge of the record, but one of the hidden foundations of humanity's expansion? What if later ages, proud of their ships and ports and empires, inherited a planet whose first navigators had already solved the oldest question in secret, whether fear of the horizon could be mastered? If so, then the beginning of civilization may not lie only in the city, the temple, or the field. It may also lie in the fragile craft that left no trace. The sea keeps that thought to itself. It moves over drowned shelves and forgotten embarkation points with the same dark patience it had then. Beneath those waters may rest campsites, tools, pollen, footprints hardened in mud before the tide took them forever. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the evidence will always remain partial, enough to unsettle but never enough to close the circle. That too may be part of the warning. History is not always destroyed by fire or decree. Sometimes it is erased by slow inundation, and later generations mistake the resulting silence for proof that nothing important was ever there. The first ocean crossings remain suspended in that silence, like lantern lights seen briefly across black water, asking whether the oldest human journeys were forgotten by chance, or whether the world itself has been teaching people from the beginning how easily truth can drown. If the first crossings remain difficult to see, It may not be because they never happened in the deliberate way some now hesitate to imagine. It may be because the world that held their traces no longer stands where it once did. The shorelines from which people departed, the tidal flats where they gathered shellfish, the sheltered coves where fragile vessels may have been repaired with patience and repetition, the campfires that burned beside estuaries rich with food and birds may now lie far beyond sight, sealed under water and pressure and sediment. History, in this case, may not have been broken by neglect alone. It may have been physically lowered beneath the horizon. This is where the story grows stranger, because the disappearance was both dramatic and ordinary. At the end of the Pleistocene, as great ice sheets retreated and the climate shifted, sea levels rose across the world. Not in one single apocalyptic wall of water everywhere at once, but in long pulses, interruptions, surges, and centuries of relentless transformation. Land that had once stretched outward from continents began to narrow. Plains became marsh. Marsh became tidal water. River mouths widened into bays. Entire coastal ecologies were rearranged without asking whether the human memory attached to them would survive. In deep time, the ocean does not conquer with noise. It edits. Modern people inherit coastlines as though they were stable truths, as though the map has always deserved its neat edge between land and sea. But the ancient world was less obedient. During lower sea stands, vast portions of the continental shelf were exposed. These were not empty margins. They were habitable, often generous places. Fresh water, estuaries, fish runs, shellfish beds, migratory birds, edible plants, and navigable edges would have drawn human groups again and again. Such zones are exactly the sort of places where innovation gathers quietly, where observation becomes tradition, where a shoreline teaches movement. And because these places were so attractive, they may also have been where some of the most important experiments in seafaring first occurred. That thought carries a melancholy weight. If the most useful coasts were the first to drown, then some of the most important evidence of early ocean migration may have been taken precisely because it was attached to the best possible human habitats. What remains on land, then, may be only the inland residue of a story whose real centre of gravity has vanished below the modern sea. Archaeologists have long known this problem in principle. Submerged landscapes are not a poetic exaggeration. They are geological fact, yet facts of that kind do not always penetrate popular memory. The public still tends to imagine prehistory on dry land, under open sky, waiting to be excavated from caves or valleys. Meanwhile, the seafloor keeps another archive, one much larger and much harder to reach. There is something almost cruel in that arrangement. The earliest mariners may have launched from precisely the places least likely to preserve their memory for later science. Their camps could have been flooded, their refuse scattered, their footprints erased not once but repeatedly, as transgression after transgression reshaped the boundary between land and water. Even when underwater archaeology begins to recover fragments of these lost worlds, it does so slowly, expensively, and often under poor conditions. Visibility fails, sediment buries, currents interfere. Organic remains, when they exist at all, may be damaged almost beyond interpretation. One begins to understand that prehistory is not merely old, it is structurally wounded. From that wound, certain questions rise. How much of the human coastal past has already been lost? How many sites that might once have clarified migration routes now lie under meters of water and sediment? How many assumptions were built because inland evidence survived while coastal evidence drowned? The usual narrative of human movement has often leaned toward what can be more easily found. This is understandable. Science must work with available material, but availability is not neutrality. Preservation is not fairness. The Earth does not distribute evidence according to later intellectual need. It preserves in patches and erases in patterns, and those patterns can subtly shape the stories scholars feel permitted to tell. The earliest migrations across oceans are especially vulnerable to this distortion. If those journeys depended on coastal adaptation, and if coastal adaptation was concentrated in zones now submerged, then the apparent scarcity of proof may say less about human incapacity than about geological concealment. This does not mean every extravagant claim about forgotten global civilization should be accepted. It does not mean myth should replace method, but it does invite a more careful humility. When a timeline feels sparse, one has to ask whether the sparsity belongs to the past itself or to the survival of its evidence. There are hints, of course, not enough to dissolve uncertainty, but enough to disturb complacency. Archaeology in Sahul, island Southeast Asia, and other migration corridors has gradually pushed dates deeper and made old certainties less comfortable. Genetic work has revealed population histories more intricate than earlier models once allowed. Paleo-environmental reconstruction has made visible entire ancient landscapes no living eye had seen. Even so, the impression remains that science is working around a shadow. The coasts where many of the decisive acts occurred are still missing, and so each new finding feels like a shard from a vessel too broken to reassemble. Perhaps that is why flood traditions echo with such peculiar persistence across the world. They may not be records in the narrow modern sense, yet they are difficult to dismiss entirely as decorative imagination. In many cultures, memory preserves a sense that the edge between land and sea has not always been fixed, that places once inhabited were taken, that ancestry is tied not only to survival, but to retreat. One must be careful here. Oral tradition is not a map with coordinates waiting to be translated, but neither is it empty. It carries emotional geology. It remembers that water can erase geography faster than identity is prepared to follow. The thought becomes more haunting when placed beside the earliest crossings. The people who first ventured between islands or toward new continental shores may have done so in a world of broader coastal plains, richer deltas, and exposed passages that no longer exist. Their descendants, many generations later, may have watched parts of that world disappear. The first mariners and the first witnesses to drowned homelands may, in some cases, have belonged to the same long memory. If so, then human migration across oceans was never just a story of outward movement. It was also a story of withdrawal, of adaptation under pressure, of leaving not only because one wished to arrive elsewhere, but because the familiar ground itself was narrowing. This is the point at which history begins to resemble a half-buried mechanism. One part can be seen. People were present in places that required water crossing. Another part can be inferred. Coastlines were profoundly altered and often destroyed, but the central gears, the lived techniques and repeated departures and accumulated knowledge that join those facts together, remain mostly hidden. Some would say that absence should caution against enlarging the story too much. Others might quietly suspect the opposite, that the true scale of early human maritime skill has been underestimated for generations, simply because the sea absorbed the training ground. No decree is needed for such an erasure. No empire, no priesthood, no archive set aflame. Nature is capable of censorship that looks almost innocent from a distance. Water rises, sediment settles, maps update, and future civilizations inherit the edited version. Then textbooks emerge from the surviving fragments and speak with the confidence of dry land. Yet beneath them, perhaps only a little beyond reach, the drowned world remains where it always was, holding its estuaries, its vanished beaches, and the possibility that the oldest human journeys have not been disproven by silence at all. They have merely been hidden in the one place where memory is hardest to recover, and where every answer arrives already blurred by the tide. By the time the trail of early humanity approaches Wallacea, the comfort of land begins to dissolve. The name now given to that vast island realm between Sunda and Sahul belongs to modern science, but the deeper reality it describes is much older than language preserved in books. It is a broken geography, a world of straits, shifting channels, volcanic silhouettes, reefs, sudden depths, and islands scattered like unfinished thoughts across warm water. Even when the sea was lower and the continents stood wider than they do today, Wallacea did not become a simple bridge. It remained fractured. It remained uncertain. It remained, in the most unsettling sense, a place where migration could no longer pretend to be only a matter of walking. That is why this region has acquired such quiet importance in the history of human dispersal. One does not arrive there and continue onward without confronting a fact that changes the emotional structure of prehistory. At some point, people had to leave ground that felt secure and move toward land that may not have been fully visible, or at least not fully understood. The old image of humanity spreading slowly, almost automatically across connected landscapes begins to falter here. Wallacea introduces choice into the narrative with unusual force. It suggests not only movement but decision. Not only decision but preparation. And once preparation is admitted, the ancient traveller begins to look less like a passive wanderer and more like a thinker in motion. This does not mean certainty is easy. Nothing about this story offers itself without resistance. Archaeological traces appear in fragments, and interpretations still shift around them. Yet the broad outline remains difficult to escape. Human beings passed through these islands and eventually reached Sahul tens of thousands of years ago. The route could not have been completed without water crossings. There is no later invention waiting in the wings to rescue the chronology. No tidy moment in which real maritime ability finally appears and explains everything backward. The crossing comes first. The implication follows afterward, whether history feels ready for it or not. To imagine Wallacea in those distant ages is to imagine a geography that tested perception itself. Islands rose and disappeared at the edge of sight. Weather altered visibility. Currents cut between land masses with indifference. Volcanoes would have marked the horizon at times like dark signals, but a signal is not a destination. Even where one shore could be seen from another, seeing is not the same as arriving. Wind shifts. Water resists. Human bodies tire. A crossing that appears modest on a satellite image or a modern chart is transformed entirely when stripped of engines, metal, and rescue. Distance becomes psychological long before it becomes measurable. This is where the argument over accident begins to feel increasingly strained. It is one thing to imagine a small group blown from its intended course by a storm. It is quite another to build an entire human presence across remote lands on the back of repeated misfortune. Accidental arrival may happen once, but persistence implies pattern. Pattern implies retained knowledge. Somewhere, perhaps over many generations, the sea ceased to be only a force that separated and became a medium through which intention could travel. The crossings through Wallacea may not have been elegant in the later nautical sense, but elegance is not required for success. Repetition is, and repetition carries memory inside it. A people does not repeat dangerous movement without some structure for remembering how it was done. It may not be written. It may not be formalized in the ways later civilizations recognized as knowledge. But it exists. It lives in teaching, imitation, taboo, rhythm, timing, and the body's acquired trust in procedures that once felt impossible. How to bind materials so they hold under strain, when to leave, when not to leave. How to read the water's colour, how to watch birds and infer land, how to judge whether clouds are resting over an island or merely forming in place. These things, if they were known, would have shaped the migration more deeply than any artefact likely to survive. And yet such knowledge is nearly invisible to archaeology. This is one of the more haunting imbalances in the study of deep history. The material record can sometimes tell that people arrived, but not how confidence was built before arrival became possible. It can preserve a stone tool dropped on a campsite, but not the conversation that preceded departure. It can date charcoal, bone, shell, pigment, but not the inward decision to trust a craft floating over a dark channel. The closer one looks at Wallacea, the more one feels this asymmetry. The facts that survive are hard enough to matter and incomplete enough to trouble every conclusion built around them. There is also the question of what these voyagers expected to find. Did they know of lands beyond the next visible island through stories passed along from previous journeys? Did they move in stages, each crossing producing another horizon and another rumour? Did some of them set out without certainty of landfall, trusting currents and signs in ways that now seem almost impossible to reconstruct? The modern mind is tempted to divide such possibilities too sharply, as though the past must choose between blind accident and calculated exploration. But human reality usually lives somewhere in between. Curiosity and necessity mingle. Partial knowledge becomes action. Risk is accepted not because uncertainty disappears, but because life on familiar ground begins to make uncertainty bearable. That last possibility matters more than it first appears. Migration is rarely a simple romance with the unknown. People move because resources shift, because climates alter, because coastlines transform, because populations grow, because stories circulate, because conflict narrows one future and opens another. Wallacea may have been a corridor, but corridors are not neutral. They are shaped by pressures behind the traveller as much as by destinations ahead. In that sense, the early crossings might reflect not only technical ingenuity, but social and environmental tension already underway. A boat, however simple, is never just a machine. It is evidence that staying had become insufficient. If so, then the earliest ocean migrations begin to acquire another layer of depth. They are not merely proof of human daring. They are signs of adaptation under pressure, decisions made in landscapes where the margin between safety and movement had thinned. The sea, often imagined as the obstacle, may also have been the answer. A passage between islands could hold danger, but it could also hold access to food, territory, refuge, or possibility. This changes the emotional geometry of migration. The water no longer stands only as terror. It becomes ambiguous. It threatens and invites at once, which is perhaps why it occupies such a powerful place in later myths of crossing, exile, origin, and return. The farther the story moves into Wallacea, the more difficult it becomes to maintain a version of prehistory in which genuine maritime intelligence belongs only to later ages. Something older was already taking shape here, something less monumental but no less significant. Not an empire of the sea, not organised fleets with banners and ledgers, something quieter. Communities learning that the horizon could be negotiated, traditions emerging without inscriptions, expertise existing before prestige. It is a possibility that history sometimes struggles to hold, perhaps because it gives profound competence to people who left behind so little that later civilizations could admire. And yet the islands remain, the channels remain, the depths remain. The geography itself still testifies, even when artifacts are scarce. It says that humanity did not simply spill outward by luck alone. It says that somewhere among these volcanic outlines and restless straits, bodies and minds were already being transformed by the demands of crossing. A species shaped on land was beginning to think with water. That transformation may have been gradual, uneven, easily lost, perhaps even forgotten and reinvented in different times and places. But once it happened, history could never fully return to the shore it started from. And still, one question lingers in the dark between those islands. If early people could learn to cross broken seas in such remote ages, guided only by memory, observation, and fragile craft, then how much of their knowledge was later drowned, dismissed, or reduced to the faintest residue simply because it belonged to a world that preserved almost none of its own beginnings? Wallacea does not answer. It only opens farther, like a chain of silhouettes at dusk, each one promising land while withholding the deeper truth of how many crossings had already been made before anyone thought to call them history. The deeper this journey moves into the earliest ocean migrations, the more history begins to depend on objects that almost never survive. A shoreline may drown. A campsite may scatter. A bone may fragment. But a vessel, the very thing that could have made the crossing possible, is often lost even more completely than the people who rode upon it. Wood softens, splits, and disappears. Fibres decay into silence. Reeds collapse back into the wet places from which they were cut. Hide stiffens, tears, and returns to the chemistry of the earth. The farther one travels into prehistory, the more decisive technology seems to become, and the less visible it remains. This is one of the quiet cruelties of the subject. The evidence most essential to understanding early seafaring may have been made of exactly those materials least likely to outlast time, pressure, water, and bacterial hunger. Later civilizations often leave anchors, harbour walls, inscriptions, iconography, standardized hull forms, wrecks that can still be studied like frozen arguments about design. But the earliest mariners may have worked in a different register altogether. Their craft may have been local, improvised, seasonal, and endlessly repaired. They may have been dismantled after use, hidden from storm damage, recycled into shelter, burned when no longer trusted. A boat does not need to be permanent to change history. It only needs to hold together long enough to carry people beyond the edge of the known. That fact should alter the emotional weight of what is being asked. When modern minds wonder whether Paleolithic humans could cross open water, the question is sometimes framed as though capability must announce itself in durable form, as though only a surviving hull or a carved depiction would grant permission to believe. But preservation has never been the same thing as importance. Some of the most transformative human inventions vanish almost as soon as they are used, especially when made in worlds where utility mattered more than legacy. The first ocean-going technologies may have been among humanity's most consequential disappearances. What kind of vessels these were remains uncertain, and uncertainty is part of the pressure that keeps the subject alive. Simple rafts are often imagined first, perhaps because they suit the modern desire to make deep prehistory humble and provisional. Bundles of reeds, lashed logs, crude platforms held together by plant fibre or sinew. Such forms are possible. In some environments they would have been plausible, even effective for short crossings. Yet possibility is not explanation. The problem is not merely whether something could float. The problem is whether it could carry people, perhaps children, perhaps tools, perhaps fire-making materials across channels where currents pulled sideways and weather could turn without warning. Stability, buoyancy, timing, and group coordination matter more than the romantic simplicity of the image. It may be that different regions demanded different solutions. A reed craft that served one wetland coast might fail in a reef-cut channel. A lashed log platform could work for one stage of migration and become useless in rougher water. Bark, bamboo, driftwood, hide, dugout forms, or hybrid constructions may all have had their place, though the archaeological proof remains painfully thin. Ethnographic parallels from later traditional societies can offer glimpses but never certainty. They show what human beings are capable of building with minimal metal or no metal at all. They reveal that sophisticated watercraft need not depend on literate civilization. But analogy is always delicate. It can illuminate without proving. It can guide imagination while still leaving the prehistoric vessel itself hidden, almost teasingly, just outside the reach of evidence. Perhaps that is why the lost boat has become something larger than a missing artifact. It feels like a symbol for an entire category of intelligence the past may have possessed in abundance, but recorded only in biodegradable form. To build a seaworthy craft, even a humble one, requires more than materials. It requires testing, failure, adjustment, pattern recognition, and trust distributed across a community. Someone notices which wood cracks less. Someone learns which fibre swells tight when wet and which loosens. Someone discovers that weight must be balanced differently when crossing current instead of still water. Someone remembers that departures after a certain wind are unwise. This is engineering before the word existed, empirical knowledge without manifesto, design carried in hands rather than diagrams. and such knowledge can be ancient without becoming visible to later admiration. There is a tendency in historical storytelling to associate complexity with monuments, because monuments flatter the eye of posterity. Stone survives and therefore claims dignity. But a vessel is a moving monument that often leaves no ruins. It represents not stillness, but function, not the desire to be seen by the future, but the need to solve a problem in the present. If the earliest human migrations across oceans depended on such technologies, then part of civilization's prelude was not architectural at all. It was nautical, practical, and transient. A series of floating solutions may have carried populations into new worlds, while leaving future scholars with almost nothing but the unsettling fact of arrival. The scarcity of direct evidence has invited skepticism, but it has also invited a subtler danger: underestimation. When proof is thin, imagination tends to shrink rather than expand. The early craft is pictured as barely adequate, almost accidental, as though prehistory must always operate at the edge of incompetence. Yet people who live near coasts depend on tides and observe seasonal water for generations are not likely to remain naive about flotation, drift, or balance. Their knowledge may not produce ships in the later ceremonial sense, but it can produce enough. Enough is often the real threshold in history. Enough to cross, enough to return, enough to teach, enough to make the next voyage feel less like madness and more like inheritance. That word matters. Inheritance. Because a technology capable of moving people across water becomes culturally meaningful only when it can be passed on. A single crossing, however astonishing, does not create maritime tradition by itself, but repeated crossings do. They gather rituals, cautions, apprenticeships, and stories. Perhaps the earliest builders spoke of certain woods as temperamental, and others as loyal. Perhaps children learned knots before they learned the deeper names of stars. Perhaps songs counted strokes, or encoded distances not in numbers, but in remembered sequences of effort and silence. No evidence can confirm these details directly, and so they must remain in the realm of restrained possibility. Yet the absence of exact proof should not blind the mind to the scale of what repetition would have required. There is another shadow here as well. If later historical systems, especially those shaped by imperial scholarship, often preferred to imagine primitive humans as bounded by land, then the lost boat becomes more than an archaeological problem. It becomes an intellectual inconvenience. A fragile craft built in prehistory does not fit comfortably within narratives that reserve innovation for later centres of power. A people crossing broken seas without writing, metallurgy, or state structure complicates too many old assumptions about where sophistication properly belongs. No conspiracy is needed for such discomfort to have consequences. Sometimes a civilization edits the past simply by finding certain capacities easier to admire when they appear in familiar costumes. Still, the sea remains indifferent to prestige. It does not care whether a vessel is remembered in an epic or vanishes nameless into decomposition. It only tests whether the thing floats, whether it holds, whether its makers understood enough of wave, weight, and timing to survive the passage. That brutal neutrality may be the purest witness available. If humans reached islands and continents that required crossings, then some form of working maritime technology existed. It may have been elegant or crude, beautiful or improvised, communal or experimental, but it existed. Somewhere in deep time, a set of materials became a threshold between one human world and another. And yet, because almost none of it remains, the first boat continues to haunt the edges of history, like an object seen only by its consequences. A people appears where no land route could have brought them. A crossing must be inferred. A vessel must be imagined. Hands must have shaped something that water accepted, however briefly. Then the craft vanishes, its fibres loosened, its frame gone soft, its memory perhaps retained only in bodies and voices that also disappeared. This is the paradox left behind by the oldest migrations across oceans. The technology may have been real enough to redirect humanity, but fragile enough to leave posterity doubting its own beginnings. And where doubt lingers too long, another question always waits behind it. If the vessels are gone, if the shores are drowned, and if the knowledge was carried mostly in perishable things, then how much of early human mastery over water has been lost, not because it was small, but because it was never built to survive the kind of world that came after it. Once the vanished vessel is allowed to exist even as an inference rather than an artifact, the coastline of ancient Sahul begins to feel less like a final destination and more like a threshold crossed by people already carrying a dense, unrecorded intelligence. The arrival itself is often treated as the astonishing part, and in one sense it is. To reach a continent-sized landmass separated by water in such remote ages is no small matter. But the deeper mystery may lie not in arrival alone, but in what had to be known before arrival could become something more than a fortunate accident. Crossing can happen once by chance. A human world cannot take root by chance for long. Australia holds that tension with unusual power. The continent is vast, ecologically varied, often severe, and ancient in a geological sense that seems to radiate through its deserts, escarpments, river systems and coastlines. Human presence there reaches far back into time, far enough to force history into an uncomfortable posture. However, one debates specific dates, whether leaning toward the more conservative range or toward earlier possibilities. The fact remains that people were in Sahul deep in the late Pleistocene. Once there, they did not linger as a marginal accident. They spread, they adapted, they made a world. That is where the scale of the achievement begins to widen beyond the narrow drama of one crossing. To arrive in a new land is one thing, to remain is another. To remain across generations, to move through drastically different environments, to locate water, read seasons, understand animal patterns, and reshape lifeways without written manuals or inherited maps of the new terrain, suggests a depth of human flexibility that still has not been fully absorbed into the modern imagination. It is tempting to think of these early populations as precarious bands hovering at the edge of failure. But that may be another distortion produced by distance. They were not merely surviving a miracle, they were building continuity out of uncertainty. This matters because continuity implies preparation before landfall. A people capable of establishing themselves after an ocean crossing must have carried more than tools and bodies. They must have carried transferable knowledge, fire management, social coordination, kinship rules, food gathering strategies, perhaps even an ability to interpret unfamiliar species quickly through analogies with those already known. Their worlds would not have been conceptually empty. They would have arrived with habits of attention. Habits may be the most underestimated inheritance in prehistory. They do not fossilize, yet they structure everything. And so the ancient settlement of Sahul quietly undermines one of the oldest prejudices about deep time. It suggests that very early humans were not waiting for civilization to make them capable. They were already capable in ways civilization later rebranded as its own achievements. Observation, cooperation, ecological sensitivity, and technological improvisation did not begin in cities. They began wherever a human group was forced to notice reality closely enough to remain alive. The first ocean crossings into Sahul may therefore belong not to the preface of human ingenuity, but to one of its earliest mature expressions. This is where the story becomes almost philosophical. If those early migrants could organize a successful movement across water and then adapt to a massive unfamiliar land, what does that say about the nature of intelligence itself? Modern narratives often reward visible accumulation. Stone walls, formal navigation systems, standardized craft, archives, institutions. Yet Sahul implies something subtler and perhaps more profound. Intelligence can be portable without being monumental. It can exist in memory, in repeated actions, in the timing of departures, in the division of labour, in the body's trained response to environment. It can arrive without announcing itself to future textbooks. The archaeology of Australia, varied and still debated in places, hints at this layered depth without fully closing the questions. Sites such as Medjedbeb have sharpened debate over how early humans were present, and how complex their lives may already have been. Stone tools, pigments, grinding stones, traces of plant use and other material residues begin to suggest not a raw foothold, but a textured existence. No single site resolves the full migration story, and caution remains necessary. But caution need not flatten wonder. If anything, the fragments that survive suggest that what is missing may be even more significant than what has been found. A few preserved signals on land may be the remainder of a much larger coastal and cultural system now erased or dispersed. There is also the difficult question of speed. However gradually or unevenly the first people entered Sahul, the spread into different ecological zones implies movement, experimentation, and local learning on a continental scale. Coast, savanna, woodland, river corridor, interior. Each demanded new readings of landscape. Each imposed its own rhythms of scarcity and abundance. Such expansion does not resemble the hesitant footsteps of a population barely clinging to life after a lucky landfall. It resembles competence adapting in motion. Not omniscience, certainly not ease, but the kind of grounded resilience that only emerges when people already know how to transform uncertainty into method. Perhaps that is why the older image of primitive drift voyagers feels so incomplete. It is not that vulnerability was absent. Of course it was present. Every ocean crossing in deep time must have held terror. Every unfamiliar season must have carried the possibility of hunger, miscalculation, death. But vulnerability does not exclude sophistication. On the contrary, the most fragile conditions often generate the sharpest forms of intelligence. A people does not spread across Sahul simply because it is brave. It does so because bravery is tied to memory, and memory to technique, and technique to social trust. Beneath every migration lies a structure of relationships. Someone teaches, someone follows, someone resists, someone persuades, someone recalls the route, or the signs, or the failures of the previous attempt. And perhaps this is where another kind of loss enters the story. The first migrants into Sahul almost certainly carried not only practical knowledge, but ways of understanding movement itself. The journey across water may have been explained through story, obligation, cosmology, ancestral precedent, or ritual caution. Such frameworks do not belong only to later religion, in any formal sense. They belong to the human need to place risk inside meaning. A crossing without meaning is only danger. A crossing attached to lineage, necessity, memory, or promise becomes something else. It becomes bearable. Yet these interpretive worlds are among the hardest things to recover from prehistory. Material traces can hint at lifeways, but the inward architecture of why people accepted those lifeways often remains hidden. That hidden architecture may be one reason so many later traditions treat landfall as something sacred, dangerous, or cosmically charged. To come ashore is never merely geographic. It is moral, emotional, and symbolic. A new coast can mean refuge, exile, fulfillment, or the beginning of forgetting. The first settlers of Sahul may not have named their experience in ways later listeners could translate, but the force of it must have been immense. Behind them lay a world of islands, channels, and remembered departures. Ahead of them stretched a land so large that its scale would only slowly reveal itself. To arrive, there was not to solve the mystery. It was to enter a larger one, and that larger mystery lingers over the entire question of early ocean migration. If people could reach Sahul and then build enduring human worlds across it, then the intellectual and cultural capacities required for maritime dispersal must have been deeper than surviving evidence can show. The first voyages begin to look less like isolated acts and more like the exposed edge of a hidden system of knowledge, a system partly preserved in archaeology, partly lost to drowned coasts, and partly reduced to silence because later ages preferred to imagine the remote past as a dim corridor leading toward themselves. Australia stands against that simplification with quiet force. It does not shout its lesson. It waits in the long chronology of occupation, in the resilience of human adaptation, in the fact that people crossed water and remained. Something had already ripened in humanity by then. Something flexible, communal, observant, and brave in a disciplined rather than theatrical sense. Yet the sea that made that expansion possible still conceals too much. It leaves history with a continent full of human presence, and only fractured glimpses of the passages that made that presence possible. And from within that fracture, a more unsettling thought begins to form. If the first settlement of Sahul required such intelligence, such shared memory, and such tolerance for risk, then perhaps the greatest mistake is not that the modern world knows too little about those people. It may be that it has spent too long refusing to imagine how much they already knew before they ever touched that shore. Beyond the first settlement of Sahul, the sea does not become less mysterious. It becomes more intimate, more layered, more difficult to dismiss as a mere barrier briefly overcome and then abandoned. Once human beings have crossed into a new world and remained there, the water between islands can no longer be imagined only as a line of separation. It begins to look like a field of memory, a medium through which techniques, stories, kinship, and fear itself may have continued to move. This is where the story drifts outward toward near Oceania, and much later, toward the far more widely spaced island worlds of remote Oceania, where the old question returns in another form. How early did human beings begin treating the sea not as an obstacle at the edge of life, but as part of life's interior design? The answer is not simple, and perhaps it never will be. The peopling of near Oceania reaches far back, while the movement into remote Oceania appears much later in the archaeological record, associated with better defined pulses of expansion, including the Lapita horizon and the emergence of remarkable navigation traditions across the Pacific. In that mainstream structure, there is already enough wonder to disturb any complacent view of ancient humanity. Long before modern instruments, communities learned to read swells, stars, birds, cloud forms, reef patterns, and seasonal rhythms with a discipline so refined it still unsettles those raised to believe that precision must wear the clothing of formal science. Yet the farther one looks, the more another possibility hovers at the edge of visibility. Not a contradiction of accepted chronology, but a murmur around it. A sense that maritime intelligence may have roots deeper than the surviving evidence cleanly reveals. This is the point at which speculation must be handled with care. The sea invites exaggeration because it hides so much. Islands, especially remote ones, tempt the imagination into turning every unexplained pattern into proof of a vanished global order. Such leaps are understandable but dangerous. The desire for lost master civilizations can become a way of refusing the quieter, more distributed brilliance of real human communities. Still, caution should not become another form of blindness. The fact that later, better preserved voyaging traditions were astonishingly complex does not mean such complexity appeared suddenly, without antecedent, from an empty cultural landscape. Traditions accumulate, skills deepen over generations. Knowledge that later becomes visible in polished form often begins long before anyone records it. That is what gives the Pacific its haunting intellectual atmosphere. In later periods, the evidence becomes strong enough to command respect. Oceanic navigators crossed enormous distances, settled islands separated by vast waters, and carried with them crops, animals, languages, social systems, and cosmologies. They did not drift blindly. They moved with intent, even when the intent operated through methods outsiders once struggled to understand. The stars became part of the canoe. The ocean swell became a text written in motion. Islands announce themselves not only by sight, but by reflected cloud, bird behaviour, and changes in wave interference. This is now better appreciated than it once was, though admiration came late and often reluctantly. And that lateness matters. For a very long time, many outside observers underestimated or openly denied the sophistication of non-literate navigational systems, especially in Oceania. Colonial attitudes found it easier to imagine accidental drift than disciplined seamanship. This habit of disbelief is not trivial. It shaped what kinds of historical capacities were thought plausible in deep time. When a culture does not preserve its knowledge in the written forms familiar to empires, its achievements are often treated as instinct rather than intellect. The Pacific suffered from this distortion for generations. Even after evidence accumulated, the correction came slowly. One begins to wonder how many similar underestimations may still shadow the earliest ocean migrations. This does not mean that remote Oceania was settled in some impossibly ancient forgotten age unsupported by evidence. The dates for its major phases of settlement remain among the strongest anchors available. But anchor is not the same as total explanation. If later voyaging systems were so intricate, what longer apprenticeship of the human mind prepared the possibility? How many coastal and island traditions, partially lost or transformed, fed into that eventual flowering? How much of the training ground lay in earlier archipelagos where preservation is poor and roots remain partially obscured? The archaeological record can indicate when certain islands were settled. It does not always capture how long a culture had been practicing toward that horizon before making the leap that finally leaves recoverable traces. There is another unease here as well. Human migration is often narrated as if the sea separates phases neatly. First land movement, then later maritime expansion, then eventually the great navigators of the Pacific. But reality may have been less segmented. The coast is already a maritime environment long before open ocean voyaging becomes prominent. Repeated short crossings, island hopping, fishing technologies, tidal knowledge, and inherited familiarity with craft can accumulate quietly until a threshold is crossed. What appears from a distance as a sudden transformation may in fact be the visible crest of a very old wave. That wave may have carried more than people and tools. It may have carried ways of imagining the world. On islands, scale changes. Horizons matter differently. Memory must account for absence with unusual precision. A mountain on the horizon may be both destination and ancestor. A current may belong to practical knowledge and sacred order at once. This is not mystical embellishment. It is a recognition that human beings do not separate survival, meaning, and orientation as cleanly as modern disciplines often do. A seafaring culture is not merely a population that knows how to move across water. It is a population in which the sea reorganizes thought itself. If that is true, then some part of humanity's ancient relationship with oceans may be far older than the surviving ceremonial prestige of navigation suggests. The earliest crossings into island worlds were probably not carried out by people who thought of themselves as inventing maritime civilization. They were solving immediate problems, following opportunities, responding to pressure, extending known patterns by one more channel, one more reef passage, one more horizon. But repetition changes the soul of a people. Over generations, practical crossings become a way of being. The ocean ceases to stand outside culture. It becomes one of culture's shaping conditions. And once that is admitted, the boundaries between accepted history and open question become more delicate. The mainstream chronology remains essential. It provides structure where fantasy would otherwise rush in. Yet structure should not harden into complacency. Between near Oceania and the later settlement of the wider Pacific, there may lie long intervals of experimentation, hesitation, local tradition, and lost roots that are poorly preserved rather than non-existent. The sea is full of such absences. It keeps evidence unevenly, and often seems to reveal only enough to show that more once existed. The old argument between skepticism and wonder returns here with unusual force. Skepticism protects against the seduction of grand unsupported claims. Wonder protects against the arrogance of assuming the past was only as capable as the surviving record can comfortably prove. The earliest human migrations across oceans demand both virtues at once. Without skepticism, the story dissolves into fantasy. Without wonder, it shrinks into something too narrow to fit the geography itself. The islands remain where they are, scattered across distances that still humble modern minds. That is the quiet corrective. Human beings reach them, not all at once, not in mythic perfection, but enough times with enough intention to turn separation into settlement. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth concealed inside these oceanic expansions. The sea did not merely isolate populations, it also connected them through knowledge too fluid to fossilize well. A route learned in one generation could become legend in the next and disappear in the third if conditions changed. If storms intensified, if populations broke apart, if memory narrowed, or if new powers later rewrote which forms of knowledge counted as history. What survives then may be only fragments of a much broader human apprenticeship to water. The farther the islands stretch into the horizon, the harder it becomes to believe that the story is complete. Somewhere between the accepted dates, the vanished coasts, the underestimated navigators, and the traditions that later astonished the world, there lingers a possibility both modest and profound. Humanity may have been thinking with the sea for far longer than the surviving record is able to say aloud. Long before the sea became a grand stage for the better documented navigators of later millennia, it may have served a quieter role, less dramatic in appearance, and yet more decisive in consequence. It may have functioned as a guide running beside the land, a moving companion to human migration rather than its sudden interruption. This is the atmosphere surrounding what is often called the coastal route hypothesis, the idea that early human populations moving out of Africa and across southern Asia may have advanced in close relationship with shorelines, estuaries, lagoons, tidal flats, and river mouths. It is not a fantasy built from pure longing. It emerges from ecology, archaeology, and the practical logic of movement. Yet it also carries a peculiar sadness, because if this route mattered as much as some believe, then much of its evidence now lies underwater, blurred by the same post-Ice Age seas that erased the first departure points for larger crossings. There is a certain elegance in the possibility. Coastlines are rich places. They offer shellfish, fish, crabs, seabirds, stranded marine mammals, edible plants, fresh water in nearby drainage systems, and geography that often simplifies direction. A people moving beside water does not need to invent a road. The coast itself becomes one. Not always easy, not always continuous, certainly not without danger, but patterned enough to support memory. One bay leads to another. One river mouth gives way to a headland. One seasonal abundance teaches the rhythm of return. In such a world, movement need not resemble desperate wandering. It can become cumulative, almost methodical, as generations absorb the logic of the literal edge. What makes this idea so compelling is not merely that it explains speed, it explains competence. A population living for long stretches along coasts would not experience the sea as a single dramatic test reserved for extraordinary moments. It would encounter tides daily, smell shifts in weather, observe birds feeding offshore, notice drift patterns, understand the moods of inlets and channels, and learn through repetition that water is dangerous but legible. That kind of intimacy changes the mind slowly. It turns coast-dwelling people into interpreters of margins, and once a margin is understood, crossing it in selected places begins to feel less like violating a boundary and more like extending a known pattern. This matters for the earliest ocean migrations because it offers a developmental path toward them. Instead of imagining a sharp divide between landbound hunter-gatherers and sudden mariners, The coastal route hypothesis suggests continuity. A people could become increasingly maritime without ever naming the transformation. They would gather from tide pools, fish from shore, perhaps use simple floating aids, exploit estuarine environments, cross narrow channels when necessary, and over many generations build the practical confidence that later made longer passages conceivable. What appears in hindsight as a leap may have felt, at the time, like one more careful step at the edge of familiar water, and yet, once again, the evidence suffers from a cruel geography of loss. If ancient populations did use southern coasts as major migration corridors, many of their campsites would have been located exactly where later sea level rise would bury them. Sheltered bays, river mouths, deltas, coastal plains, and productive estuaries were among the most attractive environments for human settlement. They were also among the first to be transformed as the great ice sheets melted and oceans climbed. What had once been a path became a seabed. What had once concentrated food and innovation disappeared beneath sediment. The very success of the coastal route, if it was real, may be one reason it is so difficult to see clearly now. That disappearance has consequences for historical imagination. Because inland sites are easier to find and preserve, the story of human migration often defaults toward terrestrial explanations. This is understandable, but understanding does not remove distortion. When one kind of evidence survives far better than another, it begins to dominate the narrative, even if it was not dominant in lived reality. A route need not be imaginary to become archaeologically faint. It only needs to have occupied landscapes later claimed by water. And so the coastal corridor remains in a strange position. Plausible, ecologically sensible, increasingly supported in some respects, and yet perpetually haunted by the missing archive of its own shorelines. There is also a philosophical discomfort buried in this debate. The coastal model gives early humans an adaptability that some older frameworks hesitated to grant. It suggests that movement out of Africa may have been faster, more opportunistic, and more environmentally flexible than once assumed. It presents them not as slow figures inching through a hostile world, but as populations capable of reading ecological opportunity with remarkable responsiveness. That image can still seem surprisingly modern, which may say less about them than about the long habit of underestimating people who lived before monuments. If the sea edge corridor mattered, then the first great expansion of our species may have been shaped not by the heart of continents, but by their margins. Margins have a special place in history. They are often treated as secondary, unstable, or incomplete, yet they are where exchange happens. Fresh water meets salt, river systems meet marine food webs, land certainty meets aquatic uncertainty. To live on such an edge is to become familiar with transition itself. That familiarity may have prepared ancient populations for one of the defining acts of human history, not merely leaving one homeland for another, but learning how to carry continuity through unstable terrain. Some researchers have linked this coastal possibility to the speed with which Homo sapiens appears across parts of southern Asia. The exact pathways remain debated, and there is no need to force precision where evidence still resists it. But the wider point remains striking. Movement along food-rich coastlines could help explain how populations spread across large distances, without requiring every stage to be an ecological crisis. The shore can nourish while it guides. It can sustain while it teaches mobility. It can also conceal. Unlike an inland plain, which leaves its campfires to the patience of dry sediment, the coast is forever negotiating with erosion, tides, storms, and eventual submergence. It gives generously and remembers poorly. This poor memory is one reason the coastal route carries such emotional force. It suggests that humanity may have learned some of its earliest large-scale movement, not in the preserved interior spaces where archaeology often speaks most clearly, but in those liminal environments where evidence is constantly being rearranged or lost. The first teachers of mobility may have been beaches now gone, tidal mudflats now deep underwater, marshy channels long since filled with marine sediment. In that sense, the origin of human expansion may lie not only in a geographic route, but in a vanished type of world. And perhaps that is why so many later cultures preserve an ambivalent relationship with coasts. They are places of departure and return, abundance and risk, orientation and disappearance. To follow the shoreline is to be guided by something that is never fully still. Ancient migrants living this way would have absorbed a distinct philosophy of movement, even if they never articulated it in formal terms. The land continues, but not predictably. The sea interrupts, but not always cruelly. A crossing is sometimes required, but only after long apprenticeship and reading edges. This is not yet the deep ocean in its most fearsome sense. It is something subtler, the training ground where humanity may first have learned that borders can be negotiated rather than obeyed. From there, the step toward more explicit maritime movement becomes easier to imagine. Not inevitable, not uniform, not the same everywhere, but intelligible. A people who know coasts intimately already know that the world is made of passages. Some are dry, some tidal, some visible only under certain light, some open only in certain seasons. The idea of a route changes in such landscapes. It becomes conditional, fluid, responsive. That mental flexibility may have mattered as much as any specific technology. A boat alone is not enough. One must first believe that water can be part of a path. The lingering ache, of course, is that the clearest proof may remain largely inaccessible. Marine archaeology can recover fragments. Paleocoastal mapping can reconstruct lost terrain. And environmental science can increasingly outline where ancient habitable zones once lay. But the decisive intimacy of everyday coastal life still slips away. The camps, the repeated meals, the repaired tools, the first cautious watercraft used not for heroic exploration, but for ordinary extension of a livelihood, may mostly belong to a drowned chapter of human memory. The coastal route, if it shaped the great expansion as powerfully as many suspect, was both humanity's classroom and history's first major disappearance. And so, the shoreline returns as both guide and thief. It may have led people across southern Asia, nourished them, trained their senses and prepared them for crossings that would eventually carry them beyond visible land. Yet the same dynamic earth that made the route productive later unmade the evidence. What survives is enough to suggest a pattern, enough to unsettle older certainties, but not enough to seal the argument. Perhaps that is fitting. A species that learned to move by following unstable edges may never recover a perfectly stable account of how it began that movement. The first global travellers may have stayed close to water for reasons of food, safety and direction, only to have that same water swallow the clearest trace of their passage, and in that drowned corridor lies another quiet question waiting to be faced. If humanity first learned expansion beside the sea, then how much of its earliest knowledge was formed in places that modern history can describe only after admitting that it arrived too late? When the story turns toward the Americas, the sea returns with a familiar kind of silence. For generations, the dominant image of the first peopling of the New World was shaped by ice and land, by the opening of an inland corridor between retreating glaciers, by people moving downward from Beringia into a continent waiting on the other side. It is a powerful image, and it has not disappeared entirely. Yet like so many clean historical pictures, it began to fray when new evidence, new dates, and new ecological thinking complicated its edges. The oldest human movement into the Americas may not have belonged only to an inland passage. It may also have followed a coast, perhaps one now mostly drowned, where marine resources, kelp forests, estuaries, and short-range water crossings formed a different kind of route. If so, then once again one of history's decisive chapters may have unfolded in the very places least likely to preserve themselves. The appeal of the coastal migration model in the American context does not rest on romance alone. It answers practical questions. A shoreline can sustain movement when interior ice, terrain, or ecological barriers make overland progress more difficult. Rich marine environments can feed small populations with relative reliability. Kelp forests in particular have been described by some researchers as ecological corridors, long belts of productivity supporting fish, shellfish, sea mammals, and birds from Northeast Asia down parts of the Pacific Rim. Such environments would not eliminate risk. Nothing in this story eliminates risk. But they would reduce the need to imagine the first migrants stumbling blindly through hostile emptiness. The coast offers not certainty but pattern, and pattern is often enough. There's also the matter of timing. Sites in the Americas that appear older than the once dominant Clovis first framework forced archaeology into a more complex posture. Some dates remain debated. Some sites have been fiercely contested, as is often the case when established narratives begin to shift. Yet the broader effect has been unmistakable. The human presence in the Americas appears older and more varied than the old picture comfortably allowed. Once that happens, questions about route reopen. If an inland corridor was not available early enough, or not as straightforwardly usable as earlier models assumed, then the coast becomes harder to ignore. Not proven in every detail, not free from uncertainty, but increasingly plausible. And once more, plausibility confronts a vanished shoreline. At the height of lower sea levels during the late Pleistocene, the Pacific coast of the Americas did not look as it does now. The edge of land extended farther outward. Bays, islands, and shelf plains existed where modern water now moves. Potential campsites, landing points, shell middens, small seasonal occupations, and all the ordinary debris of coastal life may now lie beneath the sea. This matters because coastal migration need not leave grand evidence at every stage. It can proceed through modest use of local environments, through repeated short movements, through stops that are archaeologically delicate even under ideal preservation. Once those settings are submerged, the problem deepens. The route becomes both more plausible and harder to prove, a pattern now almost hauntingly familiar in the larger story of early ocean migration. The possibility of short-range boating or watercraft use along this route is especially unsettling to older habits of thought. It is one thing to imagine people walking the margins of an exposed coast. It is another to admit that even the peopling of the Americas may have depended in part on maritime adaptation. The presence of islands, inlets, tidal channels, and fractured coastal geographies would have rewarded people who could exploit water rather than simply endure it. Boats in this context need not imply dramatic open ocean voyages. They might have been used for crossing channels, accessing marine resources, transporting people and goods between nearshore environments, or extending movement along coastlines more efficiently. Yet once even modest maritime skill is admitted, the psychological boundary begins to collapse. The sea is no longer the opposite of migration. It becomes one of its instruments. That shift has consequences beyond archaeology. It changes the emotional landscape of the first Americans. Instead of entering the continent solely as inland trackers, descending through ice, some may have been coast-oriented populations already familiar with marine ecologies, shore-based movement, and perhaps basic boating. Their migration in that case would not simply be a heroic struggle against a frozen wilderness. It would be a continuation of a much older human relationship with edges, tides, fish-rich waters, and routes half made of land, half made of current. The Americas would not mark the invention of such adaptation, but another expression of it. There is a kind of resistance that often appears when this possibility is discussed. Not always explicit resistance, not always ideological, but something quieter. A reluctance to let the first settlement of the Americas become too fluid, too coastal, too maritime. Part of this may come from evidentiary caution, which is valid. Archaeology must not turn absence into certainty. But part of it may also arise from an older storytelling instinct, one that prefers migrations to happen on firm ground. Land feels easier to narrate. Water complicates authorship. It introduces impermanence, perishable technologies, routes that shift, evidence that drowns, and skills that may leave little prestige behind. The sea troubles the human desire for a neat founding corridor. And yet it is difficult to escape the pattern repeating across the globe. In Sahul, in Wallacea, along the coasts of southern Asia, and now in the peopling of the Americas, the same broad tension returns. Human beings appear in places where coasts matter deeply, where sea level change erased key landscapes, and where maritime or semi-maritime adaptation may have been more important than surviving evidence can cleanly demonstrate. The recurrence itself becomes meaningful. It does not prove every coastal hypothesis in full, but it warns against the old reflex that treats water as peripheral to prehistory until later civilizations arrive to monumentalize it. The coastal movement into the Americas, if that is indeed part of the story, would also help explain another subtle fact. Human dispersal is often uneven, opportunistic, and sensitive to ecological richness. People do not move according to maps that later historians prefer. They move where life can be sustained. A kelp-lined shore, a river mouth rich in salmon, an island offering birds and shellfish, a cove with fresh water nearby. All of these can matter more than a clean theoretical route across an interior. Migration is not geometry. It is appetite, caution, habit, weather, memory, and sometimes a willingness to trust a coastline even when the coastline itself is forever changing. There is also the unsettling possibility that some of the best evidence may never be recovered in full. Marine archaeology along ancient Pacific margins is difficult, expensive, and selective. Even where submerged landscapes are mapped, connecting those landscapes to specific moments of human use is extraordinarily demanding. The result is a strange condition in which the science grows stronger while the total picture remains elusive. Each new clue refines the route and deepens the mystery at the same time. The first Americans may have moved along edges the modern world can only partially reconstruct, leaving traces in places now hidden beneath cold water and layers of sediment. This does not make the inland story meaningless. It makes it incomplete. Human migration rarely obeys a single corridor forever. Routes open, close, overlap, and diverge. Some groups may have moved inland when conditions allowed. Others may have followed coasts earlier or longer. Some may have used both strategies in different sequences. The danger lies in demanding simplicity from a process that unfolded over long spans of time and across shifting environments. The sea has a way of exposing that danger. It reminds historians that the most decisive movements are often not the ones best preserved. And so the peopling of the Americas becomes something more than a continental origin story. It becomes another chapter in humanity's long apprenticeship to unstable edges. The first footsteps may not have been only on frozen ground, but also beside tides, kelp, reefs, channels, and drowned beaches no living person will ever stand upon again. The beginning of that history may lie partly underwater, where boats have vanished, campsites are buried, and the coast itself has changed its mind too many times to yield a simple answer. What remains is enough to disturb old certainty and to leave another question hanging just beyond the reach of proof. If one of the greatest migrations in human history may have unfolded along a shoreline now largely lost, then how many foundational stories of our species have been told as landlocked narratives simply because the sea kept the first drafts for itself? By this point in the journey, the sea has already done what it always seems to do in the earliest chapters of human history. It has complicated certainty without fully destroying it. It has left enough evidence to suggest that very early people crossed water, followed coasts, adapted to islands, and treated unstable margins as livable worlds. But it has withheld enough to make every larger interpretation tremble. This trembling is where controversial theories begin, not always because they are strong, and not always because they are foolish, but because uncertainty creates a corridor where disciplined research and speculative longing often walk too close to one another. There are moments in archaeology when the accepted story grows porous. Dates appear earlier than expected. Settlement patterns refuse to fit neat models. Technologies seem more distributed than once believed. Oral traditions persist in ways that feel oddly resistant to dismissal. In such moments, the human mind does what it has always done. It tries to complete the pattern. Sometimes it completes it carefully, with method and restraint. Sometimes it leaps. The earliest migrations across oceans have invited more than their share of such leaps, because the sea is a near-perfect incubator of historical unease. It hides evidence, dissolves artifacts, erases shorelines, and then dares later generations to explain what remains without overreaching. This is how fringe theories gather their strange gravity. Some propose very early transoceanic contact long before the mainstream timelines allow. Others suggest forgotten maritime civilizations whose knowledge was lost in cataclysm. Still others point to scattered anomalies, similarities in symbols, botanical puzzles, disputed skeletal remains, or unusual archaeological dates as signs that the official narrative is far too narrow. Most of these claims remain deeply contested. Many do not survive rigorous scrutiny. Some rely on selective reading, weak association, or the old temptation to turn every mystery into evidence of a master explanation. Caution is not only reasonable here, it is necessary. And yet dismissal too can become a form of laziness. That is the uncomfortable middle ground. One does not need to believe every theory of vanished seafaring empires or impossibly ancient global networks to notice that established history has often revised itself later than it should have. There was a time when the peopling of Zahul seemed more straightforwardly limited in imagination. There was a time when Pacific navigators were patronized as drifters rather than recognized as masters of environmental reading. There was a time when Clovis stood too securely at the center of the American origin story. There was a time when coastlines were treated as secondary because inland evidence was easier to excavate. In each case, correction arrived only after resistance. This does not validate every radical idea, but it does warn against confusing institutional caution with permanent truth. The danger, then, lies in two opposite impulses. One impulse wants every anomaly to prove a hidden world-spanning system, as though history must always conceal a grand secret in order to feel alive. The other impulse wants every anomaly contained quickly, minimized until it can no longer disturb the architecture of the accepted model. Neither instinct is especially trustworthy. The first feeds on romantic excess. The second often serves intellectual comfort. Between them lies a much harder discipline, allowing unresolved evidence to remain unresolved without stripping it of significance. Consider how many debates in deep history revolve not around direct contradiction, but around thresholds of plausibility. Could very early humans have crossed larger stretches of water than once assumed? Could they have maintained repeated contact across narrow but consequential marine barriers? Could coastal and island adaptations have been sufficiently developed, sufficiently flexible, to produce movements that later archaeology only glimpses in pieces? These are not absurd questions. In many cases, they are now central questions. What becomes problematic is when they are forced beyond their evidentiary frame and made to bear conclusions they cannot yet support. Even so, the persistence of these theories reveals something real about the historical condition. People sense the incompleteness. They feel the missing coasts, the vanished boats, the drowned campsites, the scattered dates, the unstable margins between myth and memory. They notice that the oldest migrations often appear only by consequence. Humans are present where no easy land route explains them. Maritime skill must be inferred, but the direct record is thin. Whole landscapes have been lost. In such an environment, speculation is almost inevitable. It grows in the vacuum left when reality is partially visible but not fully narratable. The more interesting question may not be whether all controversial theories are right or wrong, but why they keep returning to the same emotional center. Again and again they circle around the suspicion that humanity once knew more about movement, water, and distant connection than the surviving record cleanly preserves. Sometimes that suspicion becomes distorted into fantasies of hidden super-civilizations. But stripped of exaggeration, there is a quieter possibility beneath it. Not that one lost empire explained everything, but that many small traditions of maritime intelligence emerged, flourished, disappeared, and were later underestimated because their material traces were too fragile and their prestige too low for later historical systems to honour properly. This quieter possibility is less dramatic, yet in some ways more unsettling. A single vanished master culture would simplify the mystery. One source, one destruction, one hidden archive. But distributed intelligence leaves no such comfort. It suggests that early human capability may have arisen in many places, in response to local coasts, islands, tidal systems, and social pressures. Knowledge could have been deep without being centralized, sophisticated without being imperial, effective without ever becoming monumental. Such a model is hard to mythologize, but perhaps closer to how humanity usually works. The sea does not require empires in order to be crossed. It requires enough skill, enough memory, enough trust, and enough need. There is another complication as well. Historical gatekeeping is not always malicious, but it is real. Academic systems rely on standards, replication, and evidentiary discipline, which protect the past from fantasy. They also create inertia. Careers form around models. Institutions reward caution. Extraordinary claims invite skepticism, as they should. Yet sometimes the threshold for acceptable revision becomes so high that plausible possibilities are treated as if they were reckless, simply because they threaten an older narrative structure. The effect is subtle. A question may not be banned, but it can be kept waiting at the edge of legitimacy for decades. This is where the old suspicion of rewritten history acquires its faint shadow. Not always in the dramatic sense of secret archives and coordinated suppression, though such images haunt the imagination. More often, history is rewritten by slower forces: prestige, habit, ideology, and the selective survival of evidence. A drowned coast rewrites the record. A colonial framework rewrites what kinds of intelligence are considered visible. A discipline's internal caution rewrites what counts as plausible before enough proof accumulates. None of this requires conspiracy in its theatrical form. It requires only the ordinary mechanisms by which human institutions defend coherence. And so the controversial theories remain, some crumbling under scrutiny, some evolving, some pointing clumsily toward real absences they cannot properly explain. Their persistence is not itself proof, but neither is it meaningless. They function almost like pressure points in the body of history. They appear where the narrative is weakest, where evidence is scattered, where land routes fail to satisfy, where water crossings seem necessary but underdocumented, where myth and geology begin to overlap, where the oldest human capacities seem to exceed what later generations once thought possible. In that sense, fringe theory is sometimes less a map of truth than a symptom of where official history has not yet finished its work. Perhaps that is the warning carried in all this argument. The search for the earliest ocean migrations is vulnerable both to credulity and to reduction. The sea invites each error equally. It tempts some minds to imagine vast invisible empires and tempts others to trust only what survives on stable ground. But the deepest realities may belong to neither camp. They may lie in the half-lit zone where repeated small crossings change the fate of continents, where traditions of navigation rose and vanished without inscription, and where the strongest evidence was absorbed by coasts now underwater. The truth, if it ever comes more clearly, may not flatter anyone. It may be neither grand enough for myth nor simple enough for textbooks. That is why the unanswered questions continue to matter. Not because every disputed claim deserves belief, but because some of them form around genuine fractures in the record. A broken chronology, a drowned route, an underestimated people, a technology too fragile to survive, a memory that persisted only as story. These are not inventions, they are conditions. And conditions like these ensure that the earliest migrations across oceans will remain one of history's most unstable frontiers. Somewhere beyond the failed theories and the cautious corrections, the real shape of human movement still waits in pieces. The sea has not concealed it completely, but neither has it released enough for certainty. And when the evidence remains this partial for this long, one question begins to feel almost unavoidable. Is the greatest risk in studying the ancient past that people will believe too much, or that they will keep believing too little for reasons that sound more respectable? When evidence thins and coastlines disappear, memory often changes its clothing. It stops speaking in the language of measured distances and datable layers, and begins to move through image, story, symbol, warning, and song. This is the threshold where myth enters the history of ocean migration, not as a replacement for archaeology, and certainly not as a simple code waiting to be translated into modern fact, but as another form of human continuity. The earliest crossings may have left little timber, little fibre, little shoreline to examine, but they may still have left impressions in the narrative habits of peoples who remembered movement, loss, flood, islands, and departure long after the exact coordinates were gone. This is delicate terrain. Myth can illuminate and mislead with equal ease. It cannot be read as a newspaper from deep time, nor should it be dismissed as decorative fantasy with no relation to lived experience. Human communities do not create stories in a vacuum. They create them from fear, from wonder, from environment, from ritual, from inherited tension between what was endured and what could no longer be fully explained. A flood story does not have to preserve a literal eyewitness account of a particular sea level event to retain emotional truth about a world in which coastlines shifted, waters rose, and ancestral places disappeared. A canoe of the ancestors does not have to be a historical vessel, in the narrow sense to preserve the cultural memory that movement over water once stood near the beginning of who a people became. That is why comparative mythology becomes so haunting around the edges of early migration. Across very different cultures, water often appears not simply as scenery, but as threshold. It separates worlds, births worlds, destroys worlds, conceals the dead, carries the living, and guards knowledge that is dangerous, sacred, or incomplete. Islands become places of origin, exile, trial, or transformation. Ancestors emerge from beyond the horizon or disappear into it. The sea is rarely neutral in human story. It is too unstable, too sustaining, too threatening for neutrality. It becomes the natural stage upon which memory preserves its oldest anxiety, that what once held life can vanish, and what vanishes may still shape those left behind. Flood traditions are especially difficult to ignore. They appear in many forms, with different theologies, different geographies, different symbolic structures. It would be careless to collapse them into one global event, or to claim that every deluge myth encodes a single prehistoric catastrophe. Yet it would be equally careless to pretend they have no historical significance at all. In a world emerging from the last ice age, with shorelines advancing inland over generations, estuaries drowning, wetlands transforming, and islands shrinking or separating, human groups would have had many opportunities to experience water not as an abstraction, but as a force that rearranged the map of belonging. Such experiences do not need precise chronology to persist in culture. They need only repeated emotional impact. And emotional impact is one of myth's strongest forms of preservation. This matters for early ocean migration because migration is never just movement. It is also interpretation. A people crossing water must decide what that crossing means. Is it exile? Is it obligation? Is it a sacred route opened by ancestors? Is it punishment? Is it fulfillment? Is it survival under pressure? The practical and the symbolic rarely remain separate for long. Even the most functional maritime tradition carries stories, taboos, gestures of respect, rituals of departure, explanations for storm and calm. A crossing becomes bearable when folded into significance. Without significance, risk remains too naked. With significance, the unknown can be approached without pretending it is harmless. This is why later oral traditions from seafaring and island societies deserve patience. Not gullibility, but patience. A navigator's chant, an origin story of landfall, a sacred account of islands rising from the sea, a tale of ancestors who followed birds or stars, all these may preserve layers of relationship with water too old and too transformed to separate cleanly into history and fiction. Scholars who work carefully with oral tradition often treat it neither as literal evidence nor as meaningless ornament. Instead, they look for patterns of environmental knowledge, social memory, and long-duration cultural truth. Such work is modest by necessity, but it can be deeply revealing. Stories sometimes remember what landscapes no longer can. There is also the uncomfortable possibility that modern systems of knowledge have often undervalued these narrative archives, because they do not resemble the forms of memory preferred by literate power. Writing, maps, state records, and monumental inscriptions acquired authority partly because empires and institutions built themselves through them. Oral cultures preserved differently. Their memory was embodied, performed, relational and vulnerable to disruption. Colonialism, forced conversion, displacement, and the prestige of imported knowledge systems often weakened those traditions further or taught outsiders not to hear them well. This does not make every oral account a hidden historical transcript, but it does mean that what later scholars dismissed as legend may sometimes have contained traces of ancient, ecological and migratory experience more substantial than they knew how to recognize. The sea complicates this problem further because it erases the physical counterweight that might otherwise support narrative memory. If a flood myth survives, but the drowned bay it once dimly referred to lies deep beneath later sediment, then story floats without anchor, and modern listeners become impatient. If an island tradition preserves the memory of arrival from another shore, yet the canoe technology was perishable and the departure coast is gone, the account begins to seem unprovable in a reductive way. The result is a familiar injustice. Material absence weakens narrative credibility, not because the narrative is false, but because the world that once helped interpret it has been physically removed. And yet myths persist. They persist because they do something that archaeological fragments alone cannot do. They preserve atmosphere. They carry the emotional shape of ancient realities even when the factual scaffolding is damaged. They remember that water is dangerous and fertile, that shores are unstable, that ancestors moved, that land can be lost, that orientation may depend on forces larger than human control. These are not trivial memories. They are exactly the kinds of truths one would expect to survive in transformed form among peoples whose lives were repeatedly shaped by coasts and crossings. There is a temptation, especially in modern media, to force a choice here. Either myths are secret historical documents waiting to be decoded, or they are imagination and nothing more. But the oldest human memory rarely works in such binary terms. A story can be symbolically elaborated and still rooted in environmental change. It can be sacred and historical at once, without satisfying the standards of literalist verification. It can distort details while preserving structure. In fact, that may be how very old memory usually survives. Exact names vanish. Dates evaporate. The emotional architecture remains. Water rose. People left. The old place could not be kept. The crossing mattered. The ancestors did something dangerous and irreversible. That is enough for myth to begin its long work. The earliest human migrations across oceans may therefore have two different afterlives. One is material and broken. Stone tools, sediments, genetics, shell middens, paleo-coastal reconstructions, debated dates. The other is narrative and mobile. Flood stories, ancestral voyages, sacred islands, seaborne origins, ritual warnings, songs of direction and return. Neither archive is sufficient alone. The material record without human meaning becomes skeletal. Myth without evidence becomes vulnerable to projection. But together they suggest a deeper continuity. Humanity did not merely move across water. It learned to remember water in forms appropriate to what water leaves behind. Fragments, symbols, reverence, fear. Perhaps that is why the oldest sea stories still feel so difficult to dismiss completely. Even when they cannot be verified in the strict sense, they seem to hover around the real conditions of life on unstable coasts and among islands. They sound like memories translated across too many generations to remain literal, but not so many that they lose all contact with lived experience. A drowned valley becomes a moral warning. A migration becomes an ancestral test. A route becomes a sacred line between worlds. The practical act is lifted into meaning because meaning is easier to carry than exact detail when the landscape itself has changed. And this may be one of the deepest reasons the earliest ocean migrations remain unfinished in the human imagination. They do not survive only as evidence to be dated. They survive as atmosphere around origins. In story after story, water stands near the beginning and near the loss. It births and removes. It separates and connects. It keeps what it takes. Somewhere in that symbolic repetition there may be more than coincidence. There may be the long echo of coastal humanity trying not to forget what the sea had already begun to erase. The question is not whether myth can prove the first crossings. It cannot, at least not in the way modern certainty demands. The question is whether myth has been carrying, all along, a dim but persistent memory that the earliest history of our species was written partly on shores the world no longer allows us to see. If myth preserves the emotional shadow of ancient crossings, then navigation preserves something even more elusive, the disciplined intelligence that made those crossings repeatable. A people does not move across dangerous water more than once by relying on courage alone. Courage may begin the act, but it cannot stabilize it. To return, to teach, to correct mistakes, to choose a season rather than simply endure it, requires an education of the senses so intimate that later literate cultures have often struggled to recognize it as knowledge. Yet the sea has always demanded knowledge in exactly that form. It asks for attention before theory, rhythm before abstraction, and memory before prestige. This is why the history of navigation should not be imagined as beginning only with instruments. Instruments arrive late. The sky arrives first. The body arrives first. The movement of swell against a hull, the pattern of birds leaving at dawn and returning at dusk, the shape of clouds gathering over unseen land, the changing colour of water over shoals or reefs, the smell carried by wind, the alignment of currents with season. All these belong to an earlier science, one distributed through habit rather than inscription. It may not resemble the formal structures through which modern societies certify expertise, but it produces results no less real. An island found in open water does not care whether the navigator's training was written in a manuscript or carried in flesh and voice. Later oceanic traditions reveal this with extraordinary clarity. Skilled navigators in the Pacific learned to read the sea not as blank space, but as a textured field of information. Swells refracted by islands, bird paths, cloud towers, star paths, wave interference, the feel of motion through the body itself, all could become part of orientation. Outsiders often described such abilities with awe once they understood them, though awe arrived only after a long period of skepticism and condescension. For generations, many observers assumed such voyages must have been accidents, because the sophistication required did not fit their assumptions about what non-Western, non-literate peoples should be able to do. Only slowly did that blindness begin to weaken. That history of underestimation matters, because it casts a long shadow backward. If later traditional navigators were misunderstood even in relatively recent centuries, then what chance do the earliest mariners have of being properly imagined now? The problem is not simply missing evidence. It is also conceptual inheritance. Many historical systems still carry the habit of treating written theory as the highest form of intelligence and embodied ecological mastery as something lesser, intuitive, almost animal. But the sea does not reward such arrogance. It rewards accurate perception. To move across open water without instruments is not to act without reason. It is to reason differently, in partnership with a world that is always shifting but never entirely silent. This has profound implications for the earliest human migrations across oceans. By the time people were moving through fractured island worlds or along coasts dense with tides and channels, they may already have been developing small but cumulative traditions of orientation. Nothing grand was required at first. A short crossing between visible islands still teaches lessons: how waves bend around headlands, how current alters travel time, how bird flocks may indicate roosting ground, how certain winds are helpful only in one half of the day. Over generations these lessons gather. They become a quiet curriculum. Eventually a people no longer encounters water as a single terrifying unknown, but as a system that can be read, though never fully controlled. Reading is the important word here. Navigation before instruments is often less about overpowering the environment than about learning to interpret it. In that sense, the early mariner was not only a traveller, but a listener. The sea spoke in motion and interval. The night sky offered sequence. Land was inferred before it was seen. A horizon ceased to be an empty line and became a field of clues. Such perception demands patience, but it also demands trust in inherited methods. No one discovers an entire wayfinding system alone. It is communal knowledge, refined across attempts, remembered through practice, perhaps embedded in song, ritual, taboo, and apprenticeship long before anyone thought to separate science from culture. And this is where the question grows more philosophical again. What counts as intelligence in history? Is it only what can be preserved in formal notation, or can it also be the disciplined memory of a people who know how to move without measuring in the modern way? The earliest migrations across oceans force this question with unusual pressure. They suggest that human understanding of the world may have been deep long before it became visible in the forms later civilizations privileged. A navigator who cannot write but can find land across open water is not evidence of primitive instinct. He or she is evidence that literacy and intelligence are not twins, only occasional companions. The body itself may have been one of the first navigation tools. This idea can sound poetic, but it is also practical. Motion is information. Experienced seafarers can feel subtle shifts through posture, muscle tension, and balance long before those shifts are verbally analysed. Repeated exposure trains expectation. The body begins to notice when the sea is behaving wrong, when swell patterns change, when drift differs from memory, when the vessel is moving in relation to something not yet visible. Such awareness would have been especially important in early craft where visual vantage was limited and technology offered little protection against misjudgment. Navigation, in this sense, was not detached calculation. It was lived contact. This lived contact is one reason so much may have been lost. A written manual can survive if the climate is kind and the archive is spared. Embodied skill survives only by transmission. If a community is displaced, broken, assimilated, or severed from the waters that trained it, knowledge can narrow quickly. A route once common may become dangerous through ecological change. A coastline may drown. Bird patterns may alter. Storm cycles may intensify. Political systems may suppress older practices. Sacred traditions may weaken. The intelligence disappears not because it was shallow, but because it lived in relationships rather than in durable text. That fragility may help explain why prehistory sometimes feels more ignorant in hindsight than it truly was. What was once known deeply may simply have failed to cross intact into later worlds. There is also a humbling irony here. Modern technology has made navigation easier in one sense and shallower in another. Instruments relieve the burden of constant environmental reading. They also allow people to forget how much information the world is always offering. For ancient navigators, forgetting was less available. They had to remain perceptually awake. Their lives depended on forms of notice that modern societies often reserve for specialists or abandon entirely. In that respect, the earliest mariners may have inhabited an attentional intensity now difficult to imagine, not because they were mystical, but because the sea punished inattention too quickly for abstraction to remain separate from survival. If even fragments of that attentional world existed during the first migrations through island chains and along coasts, then a troubling possibility emerges. The knowledge systems required for early ocean movement may have been far more sophisticated than surviving artifacts imply, yet so embedded in practice that archaeology can scarcely touch them. A stone tool survives. A star path does not. A shell midden survives. A rhythm for timing departure vanishes with the voices that carried it. A hearth remains. The trained bodily feel for changing swell leaves no sedimentary trace, and so the historical record fills with objects while the most dynamic forms of intelligence go missing. This imbalance has consequences. It encourages later observers to admire the tangible while underestimating the operational. The boat, if preserved, would attract attention. But the boat without navigation is only drift waiting to happen. The true achievement lies not merely in building a craft, but in integrating it into an environmental reading complex enough to make movement meaningful rather than suicidal. Once this is understood, the earlier sea crossings begin to appear in a different light. They are no longer just audacious departures. They are evidence, however indirect, of communities already thinking relationally with water, sky, season, and memory. And still the silence remains. No first navigator speaks from the record in a voice that can be quoted. No manual of Paleolithic wayfinding lies waiting beneath clean sediment. There are only later analogies, ecological logic, contested routes, and the stubborn fact that people arrived where water had to be crossed. Yet perhaps that is enough to raise the most unsettling question so far. If the first ocean migrations required not only boats, but systems of perception, an inherited orientation subtle enough to leave almost no material trace, then how much of humanity's earliest knowledge has been lost simply because it was too alive, too embodied, and too dependent on relationship with a changing world to fossilize into the kind of past that later civilizations know how to respect? By the time a story reaches the status of history, it has usually passed through many hands that were never neutral. Evidence may survive by chance, but interpretation rarely does. It is shaped by institutions, empires, disciplines, habits of prestige, and the slow, often invisible pressures of what a civilization is prepared to believe about those who came before it. This matters deeply for the earliest human migrations across oceans, because the people who undertook them left behind the kind of record most vulnerable to later dismissal. Perishable technology, drowned landscapes, oral memory, and achievements that did not come wrapped in architecture or script. In such a condition, history becomes especially easy to curate without openly admitting that it is doing so. No great conspiracy is required at first. Something simpler is enough. A scholar inherits a framework in which civilization is measured by cities, monuments, writing, centralized authority, metallurgy, or statecraft. Within that framework, very early humans may be admired for endurance, perhaps even for ingenuity, but not readily for maritime sophistication. Water crossing is allowed only in limited, almost accidental forms, until evidence becomes too strong to ignore. The old hierarchy remains present even when no one states it aloud. It whispers that the sea belongs properly to later peoples, organized peoples, legible peoples. Those who came before may approach the coast, perhaps follow it, perhaps be carried across it by necessity, but they are not easily granted the status of thinkers in water. This hierarchy has a history of its own. Colonial scholarship often interpreted indigenous and non-literate cultures through a lens of deficiency. Where traditions of navigation were advanced, they were sometimes explained away as luck or instinct. Where oral accounts preserved migration, they were treated as folklore in the dismissive sense rather than as structured memory. Where material evidence was sparse, incapacity was inferred more quickly than loss. Such habits were not confined to one nation or one school of thought. They belonged to a wider intellectual climate in which European models of documentation shaped what counted as real knowledge. If something could not be written down in the familiar way, diagrammed in the familiar way, monumentalized in the familiar way, it struggled to command full respect. The Pacific offers one of the clearest examples of how damaging this can be. Traditional navigators there were long underestimated, even when their accomplishments stood in plain sight across the geography of islands that had undeniably been settled. Outsiders often found it easier to imagine accidental drift than to admit the existence of sophisticated non-instrument navigation. That resistance now looks revealing. It shows how difficult it can be for dominant systems of thought to recognize intelligence that does not resemble their own preferred forms. Once this is understood, the earlier story of Paleolithic or late Pleistocene crossings must be reconsidered in a harsher light. If documented navigators in more recent centuries were denied full intellectual dignity, what chance did far older seafaring peoples have of being imagined fairly? This is where the suspicion of rewritten history acquires depth without needing melodrama. Rewriting does not always take the form of forged documents or forbidden vaults. More often, it happens through emphasis, omission, and the quiet authority of educational consensus. One model is repeated because it fits the surviving evidence more neatly, or because it aligns with inherited expectations about progress. Another model is labelled speculative, not always because it is weak, but because its implications are culturally inconvenient. Over time, the distinction hardens, students inherit it, textbooks simplify it, public memory absorbs it. Eventually, the edited version feels natural enough that alternatives appear radical, merely by challenging the emotional order of the established timeline. Ocean migration has suffered from this process repeatedly. Routes that probably involved coastlines were long overshadowed by inland models, because inland evidence was easier to recover and easier to narrate. Early maritime skill was treated with undue caution because durable boats did not survive. Oral traditions were often welcomed as cultural texture, but not as serious partners in reconstructing movement. Drowned landscapes were acknowledged in theory, yet underweighted in the imagination, as though submerged evidence mattered less simply because it was harder to access. None of this proves deliberate suppression, but it does reveal structural bias. History can be distorted profoundly without anyone having to meet in secret. There is another pressure at work as well, the prestige of coherence. Academic systems, for understandable reasons, prefer models that are stable, teachable, and resistant to sensationalism. This preference protects scholarship from chaos, but it also creates inertia. The more elegant the model, the more reluctant institutions may become to complicate it. The first peopling of continents, the development of navigation, the capabilities of ancient populations, all these topics can harden into narrative frameworks that continue long after the evidence has become less comfortable. Revision happens, but slowly. The appearance of objectivity is maintained even while the underlying picture shifts. In the meantime, older assumptions continue to shape what questions are considered serious. That has consequences not only for scholarship, but for moral imagination. To underestimate early maritime peoples is not just to misplace a technical skill, it is to diminish an entire mode of being human. It is to imagine those who lived without states or writing as somehow suspended beneath a threshold of full ingenuity, waiting for history to improve them. Yet the earliest ocean migrations suggest almost the opposite. They suggest that fragile technologies, collective trust, environmental reading, sensory education, and flexible forms of social knowledge may have carried humanity farther than later monumental cultures were willing to admit. The achievements were real, but they did not flatter the values of the societies that later wrote the canon. Religious and imperial institutions have also shaped the emotional structure of origins, not always by directly denying migrations, but by organising history around chosen centres. Sacred lands, imperial capitals, scriptural chronologies, and civilizational birthplaces tend to attract narrative gravity. They become the places from which history is said to begin in any meaningful sense. In such systems, marginal coasts, island chains, and pre-literate seafarers can seem peripheral even when they were foundational. The centre claims dignity. The margin supplies prehistory. What happens on the water is treated as a prelude, not as a primary act. Yet for a species that repeatedly expanded through coasts and crossings, the margin may have been the true engine all along. This does not mean every revisionist suspicion is justified. Some claims of suppressed history are clumsy or self-serving. Some exploit genuine gaps in the record to sell certainty where none exists. There are real dangers in turning institutional bias into a blanket excuse for any unsupported theory. But the existence of bad revisionism should not obscure the reality of subtler exclusion. History has always been selective, not because historians are uniquely dishonest, but because every system of knowledge is built inside human values, and human values are rarely innocent. The question is not whether selection occurs, it is how often it is mistaken for truth itself. In recent decades, some of this has begun to change. Underwater archaeology, paleoclimate research, genetics, indigenous scholarship, and more serious engagement with oral tradition have all widened the field. Older assumptions have been challenged. Coastal routes are treated with more seriousness. Non-literate navigation has gained overdue respect. Even so, the correction is incomplete. Public imagination still lags behind specialist revision. The image of the primitive early human remains strangely persistent, especially when compared to the complicated reality suggested by the evidence. It lingers because it is comfortable. It keeps ingenuity safely near the rise of familiar civilizations. Perhaps that comfort is the real issue. A history in which the earliest ocean migrants were more capable than once assumed, more observant, more adaptive, and more intellectually alive to water than many later societies ever understood, unsettles the linear vanity of progress. It suggests that human capacity does not ascend neatly in one direction. It emerges, concentrates, disappears, transforms, and is sometimes forgotten by those who inherit its consequences. A people may master a coast and leave behind almost no monuments. A route may change the world and then be erased by sea level rise. A tradition may persist in oral form and be dismissed until too much evidence gathers to ignore it. The loss is not only archaeological, it is conceptual. That is why the question of who writes history cannot be separated from the question of what history is willing to see. The earliest migrations across oceans occupy the exact zone where evidence is fragile and prejudice is most dangerous. Too little survives. Too much depends on interpretation. Too many older hierarchies made certain capacities difficult to imagine in ancient peoples. And so the sea, once again, becomes more than a setting. It becomes a test of intellectual honesty. Can the modern world admit that some of the first great acts of human expansion may have been carried out by communities it would once have called simple? Can it accept that the past was not merely missing data, but also missing dignity? No final answer settles here. The forces that shaped history's official memory are too diffuse for a single accusation, and too real for easy innocence. The record was drowned in part by nature, narrowed in part by preservation, and framed in part by the values of those who later interpreted it. Between those pressures lies the version of the past most people inherit, cleaner, drier, more land-bound, and more flattering to later civilizations than the truth may deserve. And if that is so, then another question rises from the water with quiet persistence. How much of humanity's earliest relationship with the sea remains difficult to recover, not only because the coastlines vanished, but because the minds that came later preferred a history in which the first navigators could not possibly have been wiser than they looked. After so much has been lost, it is almost startling that the buried world has begun, in fragments, to speak again. Not clearly, not generously. It does not offer the clean satisfaction of a sealed archive opened at last. What returns comes in pieces: a shelf edge mapped beneath modern water, an ancient river channel traced through sediment, a submerged landscape modelled from bathymetry, a genetic signal that suggests movement earlier or differently than expected, a site on land whose age forces the coastline story back into view. The recovery is slow, technical, and often emotionally restrained. Yet there is something deeply unsettling in it. Science is beginning to look where history once assumed little could be found, and each small success seems to reveal not closure, but a larger circumference of missing memory. Underwater archaeology stands at the centre of this new unease. For most of modern scholarship, the sea was acknowledged as a place that might hold evidence, but in practical terms it remained almost inaccessible compared with the great productivity of excavation on land. The ocean floor is expensive, dangerous, and selective. Visibility can collapse, sediment can conceal or confuse, organic remains are vulnerable. Ancient shorelines may now lie far offshore, beyond easy investigation, beneath layers of deposition built across thousands of years. It is difficult work, often frustrating work, and yet the logic behind it has become impossible to ignore. If the coasts of the Ice Age world were lower, wider, and richer than those of the present, then some of the most crucial zones of human activity now rest beneath water. One does not need romance to follow that conclusion, only consistency. Marine mapping has changed the scale of what can be imagined. What once appeared as blank seafloor can now, in some cases, be reconstructed as paleo landscape. Drowned river valleys, terraces, estuaries, former lakes, and plains that would have been hospitable to both animals and people. These reconstructions do not magically reveal campsites or boats, but they perform something equally important. They restore plausibility to worlds that had been intellectually flattened by submergence. It becomes easier to understand how ancient coastlines functioned as migration corridors when one can see, however abstractly, that they were not merely narrow strips of beach. They were entire inhabited regions, complex and productive, later taken by the sea. There is a quiet emotional force in this restoration. To reconstruct a drowned landscape is not just to generate data, it is to realise that modern maps are provincial, limited to the current arrangement of water and land, and therefore dangerously misleading when projected backward into prehistory. A continental shelf now imagined as empty depth may once have held freshwater systems, shellfish beds, travel routes, and seasonal camps. A channel now broad and difficult may once have been narrower, though still not narrow enough to remove the challenge of crossing. The submerged world begins to recover dimension, and with dimension comes a renewed suspicion that much of early human history unfolded where conventional archaeology arrived too late. Paleogenetics has deepened this uncertainty in another way. DNA does not tell stories in the old narrative sense, but it can destabilize them with remarkable efficiency. Population splits, admixture events, unexpected affinities, and the timing of divergence can all suggest movements more complex than earlier models allowed. In the study of early migrations into Sahel, across Asia, and toward the Americas, genetic work has often reinforced the impression that human dispersal was not a single corridor, but a branching, overlapping process shaped by repeated adaptation, separation, and local history. Genetics does not prove specific sea routes by itself, yet it has repeatedly reminded scholars that simple historical pictures rarely survive contact with biological evidence for long. The species moved, divided, reunited, and moved again in ways that refuse neat sequencing. Sediment science, too, has joined this widening field of recovery. Ancient pollen, Microfossils, isotopic signatures, charcoal traces, and other environmental indicators can reconstruct climates, coastlines, and ecological conditions that framed human decisions without preserving those decisions directly. Such work is subtle, almost humble in tone, but its implications can be immense. A favourable coastal ecosystem in a crucial period may make a migration route more credible. A shifting climate may help explain why movement accelerated or changed direction. A drowned estuary reconstructed from cores and models may suddenly transform from geological curiosity into likely human habitat. The effect is cumulative. No single technique solves the mystery, but together they begin to outline the stage on which the missing drama occurred. This is where the modern search becomes almost paradoxical. The better science gets at recovering ancient environments, the more clearly it can see the scale of what remains absent. Every reconstructed coastline hints at the settlements not yet found. Every genetic revision suggests routes and encounters not yet fully understood. Every newly dated site on land throws fresh pressure onto the lost coastal world beyond it. Knowledge expands, but so does the visible shape of ignorance. This is not failure. It is a more honest map. The frontier of understanding moves outward and reveals that the missing archive is larger than the old histories ever allowed themselves to imagine. There is something ethically significant in that admission. For a long time, the scarcity of evidence for early maritime adaptation was treated almost as a verdict against its importance. Now the scarcity itself is being reinterpreted. It may not signal absence of human activity, but the difficulty of preserving and detecting activity in precisely the environments ancient people often favoured. This shift does not license fantasy. It does not mean every drowned shelf conceals a forgotten civilization, but it does alter the burden of imagination. One must be careful not only not to exaggerate, but also not to diminish simply because the evidence lies in a hostile archive. Technology has made this recovery possible in ways earlier scholars could scarcely manage. Remote sensing, high-resolution seafloor mapping, improved dating methods, ancient DNA analysis, refined paleoclimate modelling, and interdisciplinary collaboration have all changed the rhythm of inquiry. The past is not suddenly transparent, but it is less silent than before. Old boundaries between archaeology, geology, oceanography, and genetics have thinned because the subject itself demands that they thin. The first ocean migrations cannot be understood by one discipline alone. They occurred at the point where climate, coast, body, technology, and social memory converged. To search for them now is to acknowledge that the ancient world was integrated in ways modern knowledge had artificially separated. Even so, the technical triumph carries a faint warning. Data can recover terrain more easily than experience. A submerged river system can be mapped, but the sound of waves against a vanished shoreline cannot. A genetic branch can be dated, but the conversation that preceded departure is gone. A paleo-coastal model can show where people could have lived, but not what they believed the water meant. The new sciences are powerful, yet they operate in a world already edited by time. They retrieve structure better than atmosphere, and atmosphere, strangely enough, is part of the truth. It is the difference between knowing that a route existed and understanding that someone trusted it enough to bring a child across it. Still, the fragments matter. They matter because they erode the old confidence with which modern history once narrated deep time from the perspective of surviving land alone. They matter because they increasingly support the intuition that coastlines and seas were not peripheral theatres in human expansion, but central ones. They matter because they return dignity to possibilities earlier generations often dismissed too quickly. Above all, they matter because they reveal that the missing world is not imaginary. It is materially real even when largely unrecovered. The drowned shelf, the lost estuary, the ancient channel, the vanished beach are not poetic conveniences. They are historical absences with coordinates, and perhaps that is the most disquieting development of all. As science sharpens, the mystery does not collapse into certainty. It becomes more exact in its incompleteness. The outline of the lost archive grows clearer, while its contents remain largely beyond reach. Humanity now possesses the tools to prove that crucial landscapes once existed, and that many of the old assumptions about migration were too narrow. Yet the final intimacy of those first oceanic worlds still recedes. The sea allows reconstruction, but only to a point. It permits the map to be redrawn, then hides the lives that gave the map meaning, so the search continues in a new mood, neither naive nor triumphant. The lost coasts are being traced, the genetic branches are being refined, the environments are being reconstructed, the old frameworks are being unsettled. But every answer seems to carry another silence inside it. The more the drowned world is located, the more obvious it becomes that the foundational acts of human migration may have unfolded across landscapes modern people cannot inhabit, and technologies modern archaeology can barely recover. What was once dismissed as empty water now appears crowded with missing context. And from that deepening realization emerges another quiet question, perhaps one of the hardest yet. If science can now show where so much of the first evidence should be, but still cannot fully retrieve it, then how long has humanity been living with an origin story shaped not by what truly happened, but by what the sea was willing to leave behind? After all the drowned shells, vanished coastlines, perishable boats, disputed routes, myths of flood, and fragments returned by science, the story begins to change its shape. It no longer feels like a narrow puzzle about when a crossing happened or which corridor was used first. It begins to resemble something larger and more intimate, almost like a buried portrait of the species itself. The earliest migrations across oceans are not important only because they carried people from one geography to another. They matter because they may reveal what human beings become when the world refuses to stay still, land narrows, water interrupts. Memory strains, the future cannot be guaranteed, and still, somehow, a small group chooses motion over paralysis. That choice may be one of the deepest patterns in human history. Civilizations often tell their beginnings as if they rose from stability. A fertile plain, a protected valley, a river predictable enough to nourish settlement, a sacred center from which order unfolded outward. These stories comfort the later imagination because they place origin in something secure. Yet the earlier story suggested by ocean migration is far less settled. It begins not in certainty but in edges, tidal places, fractured archipelagos, coasts that feed and betray, channels that can be crossed only with trust, timing, and tools fragile enough to disappear. If that story is closer to the truth, then humanity was shaped not first by permanence, but by negotiation with instability. This alters the moral atmosphere of prehistory. The earlier sea migrants were not only foragers moving through an empty world, they were interpreters of change. They lived close enough to dynamic environments to recognize that survival was not a matter of clinging blindly to place. Sometimes place itself was the problem. A shoreline altered, resources shifted, a population pressed too tightly against an old limit. Another island became visible in rumour or in weather. A channel that once inspired dread became, under pressure, a possible answer. Migration in such conditions is not a triumphal adventure. It is a wager made in the shadow of loss. And perhaps that is why these ancient crossings still feel so emotionally current. Modern humanity likes to imagine itself as unusually mobile, unusually displaced, unusually entangled with uncertainty. Yet the earliest migrations across oceans suggest that restlessness under pressure may be far older than modernity. The first people who crossed into Sahul moved through island worlds, traced coasts, or possibly followed drowned corridors into the Americas, were already confronting questions that sound almost contemporary in their emotional structure. When does staying become more dangerous than leaving? How much can memory carry when landscapes change? What knowledge is worth trusting when the route ahead has not yet become tradition? How does a group decide who crosses, who waits, who returns, who is never seen again? These are not technical questions alone. They belong to the philosophy of movement. A boat is only one part of the crossing. The other part is social willingness to imagine continuity beyond the visible shore. That willingness requires a remarkable combination of fear and discipline. Too little fear, and people act foolishly. Too much fear, and they never leave. Somewhere between those extremes lies the difficult territory in which human migration actually occurs. It is there that trust becomes infrastructure. Not stone, not walls, not inscriptions, but trust in teachers, in prior attempts, in remembered signs, in one another. Long before empires coordinated large populations with law and bureaucracy, small communities may already have been coordinating risk at an extraordinary level simply to move across water. If this is true, then civilization may owe more to migration than it often admits. Not only migration across land, which is easier for later history to narrate, but migration across unstable boundaries where the environment itself demanded innovation without prestige. The earliest mariners did not leave behind palaces, they left behind consequences, populations in new continents, adaptation in new ecosystems, mythic memories of flood and landfall. The proof of their existence lies not in monumentality, but in the fact that human life appears in places the sea had once tried to keep apart. This is a quieter kind of founding act, but perhaps a more fundamental one. Before cities could organise surplus, before temples could organise ritual, before states could organise power, groups had to learn that continuity could survive displacement. There is also something deeply sobering in the fact that so much of this foundational experience may have been forgotten because it happened in low-status forms. A reed craft leaves less legacy than a wall. A navigational chant leaves less visible residue than an inscription. A drowned campsite commands less attention than a stone chamber inland. The things that carried life forward were often the least likely to impress later ages. This is one of the great injustices of history. Posterity tends to admire what survives, not necessarily what mattered most. The earliest ocean migrations expose that injustice with unusual clarity. They ask whether the true engines of human expansion were too ordinary, too fragile, too coastal, and too communal to fit the tastes of later civilizations. Such a possibility should trouble any easy belief in progress. Progress narratives assume accumulation, a steady gathering of knowledge, control, and sophistication. But the story of ocean migration hints at another pattern. Knowledge can rise locally and vanish. Traditions can become highly refined and then break under environmental change or social rupture. A route can be mastered for generations and then lost when coastlines shift, populations fragment, or cultural priorities change. The human story may therefore be less like a ladder than like a tide line, advances, retreats, deposits, erasures. Some of what later societies celebrated as innovation may have been reinvention. Some of what they dismissed as primitive may have been the remnant of a far older mastery, already half forgotten. And then there is the sea itself, still moving beneath all this argument like an old witness unwilling to testify fully. It has always held a double role in human thought. It threatens coherence because it erases and disperses, yet it also creates connection, because it offers passage to those able to read it. That duality may be central to understanding not only ancient migration, but human identity. Ours may be a species defined less by rootedness than by learned passage. Not rootless, because roots matter deeply, but capable, again and again, of carrying enough of the old world into the new to prevent total collapse. The first ocean migrants were not abandoning humanity when they left shore. They were extending it into uncertainty. This may also explain why the memory of crossing lingers so powerfully in myth, ritual, and origin stories, long after the practical details disappear. The crossing is more than transport. It is a model of existence. One world recedes. Another cannot yet be trusted. Between them lies a moving interval where the body is vulnerable and meaning must work harder than usual to stay intact. Many ancient stories, and perhaps many human lives, unfold in that interval. Water becomes the image of transition because it behaves like transition. Unstable, necessary, difficult to possess. To cross it is to accept that certainty may not return in the same form. By now, the earliest migrations across oceans begin to look less like an isolated prehistoric episode and more like an enduring human condition. The particulars belong to deep time, but the pattern is hauntingly familiar. Environmental instability, partial knowledge, social coordination under pressure, selective memory, lost archives, later powers rewriting the dignity of the past. These are not dead themes. They continue to shape how people understand movement, belonging, and legitimacy. Perhaps that is why the ancient voyages still feel unresolved. They do not stay in the past. They keep pressing forward into the present, asking what kind of species remembers itself honestly, when so many of its beginnings occurred in places where memory itself was hardest to preserve. And there is one more discomfort hidden inside that question. If the first ocean migrations helped make humanity what it is, then the later tendency to ignore, diminish, or simplify them was never a minor scholarly error. It was a form of self-misrecognition. It allowed later civilizations to imagine that the deepest human achievements began where those civilizations preferred to look, on land, in writing, in monuments, in centres of formal power. But perhaps the first great lesson of the species was learned elsewhere, in the unstable conversation between shore and horizon, where fragile craft and disciplined attention carried life beyond what seemed safely knowable. The closer the story comes to its end, the less it feels finished. It feels widened. The sea has taken too much for closure. Too many coasts are gone. Too many boats dissolved. Too many routes remain inferred rather than seen. Yet enough survives to suggest a truth almost larger than proof. Humanity may have become itself not only by settling the earth, but by repeatedly accepting the risk of passage when the earth itself proved incomplete. And if that is so, then one final unease begins to gather before the last part arrives. Were the first ocean crossings merely episodes of migration? Or were they the earlier signs that human beings would always be drawn toward horizons, not because they were safe, but because something in our nature had already learned to survive the loss of shore?